Back when I was in college, the Student Campus Activity Council hired a famous ghost hunter to come speak at our school. I've always loved the paranormal, so I left my skeptical boyfriend behind in his dorm and hightailed it over to the auditorium. The ghost hunter was someone I'd never heard of, but he had an impressive background and seemed to have several things in the works at the time. This was in 2005. I think he actually might have a TV show now. He was a man of small stature with a little white professor's beard and a receding hairline, but the way he spoke about the afterlife was fascinating. You could tell he truly believed what he claimed to see. Either that, or he was a hell of a salesman. He had us hanging on every word. We watched some interesting video clips of his investigations. He had a nice collection of photos and scary stories to go with them. I remember one about a haunted doll that he said moved freely around the room of the person who had picked it up at a flea market, just not when anyone was around to witness it. Towards the end, he opened up the floor for questions. There were your typical dumbass college kid questions. Have you ever seen someone's head spin around like The Exorcist? Logically, stuff like that, and a few that were actually pretty interesting. I decided I wasn't going to let this opportunity to speak to someone so apparently revered in the field of the supernatural slip away, so I raised my hand. The ghost hunter spotted me, pointed, and smiled. "Yes, you, the girl in the white shirt?" "Yeah, hi," I said, and I know I sounded nervous because I felt so dumb for sounding so nervous. I was just wondering, what's the scariest thing you can remember from your career as a ghost hunter? I was halfway back in the auditorium, quite a distance from the stage, but I saw his face fall. I know I did. "Well," he said, forcing a tight little laugh. It was forced, I know it was. "There are so many scary moments to recall. They tend to pop up quite often when you are in my line of work." This got a little chuckle from the audience. I suddenly felt pretty stupid for asking the question at all. He proceeded to tell some story about tracking a poltergeist in an abandoned elementary school and his flashlight failing. I remember because it really wasn't very scary. At least it didn't seem that way for someone who hunts ghosts for a living. He moved on from the story and answered a few more questions. He didn't look my way again. When it was over and everyone started to leave, I decided not to get stuck in the crush of students leaving through the front door. Feeling somewhat dejected, like I had done something wrong, I slipped quietly out the theater exit and headed for my dorm. The ghost hunter was sitting outside on a bench near the bike racks, smoking a cigarette. I ducked my head and tried to get by without him noticing. "Hey, kid." He took another drag and crushed the cigarette out on the cement bench beside him. "Listen, I'm sorry," I remember blurting, feeling like such a stupid little girl. "I know my question was dumb. I wasn't trying to make fun of you or anything." He shook his head. He brushed the ashes off the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit. I hesitated. This could definitely be a case of stranger danger, just like they taught in the Intro to University classes. Then sat down, keeping a healthy distance between us. He was old, I was young. I could probably outrun the guy. Or who knows, maybe I was just as stupid as I felt. "I didn't tell the truth," the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older close up, the wrinkles deeper. The confident salesman aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things. "That story I told, it wasn't the scariest moment of my career." "I know," I remember saying. He nodded, as though he had known I knew. "This is the scariest moment of my career," he said, and this is what he told me. It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man. I hadn't reached success in the paranormal industry quite yet, and was left to pick up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually they were schizophrenics, whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, or children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and off I went. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break I was searching for. It was the break I needed. The only detail that truly worried me was that their teenage son, the person they claimed to be suffering from possession, had become violent with members of his family. Up until recently, he'd only acted out of character, moody. However, a week prior, he had tried to rape his older female cousin. She was shaken but mostly unharmed. The family sent her to live elsewhere until it could all be figured out. Therefore, when I headed out to their home, I made sure to arrive fully prepared. I brought holy water, crucifixes, sage, and, just for good measure, a small, loaded handgun. I knew it wouldn't come to that, but something about the mother's frantic tone over the phone told me it was just a good idea. I wish I could say the visit itself was exciting. Unfortunately, from the moment I pulled into the driveway of the beautiful remodeled Victorian, all activity seemed to stop. That is, if it was ever there to begin with. I spent 2 weeks investigating the home. I used equipment considered very technologically advanced for the era. I studied energy waves. I interviewed the son whose family claimed to be possessed, when in fact he just seemed to be depressed, perhaps psychologically disturbed. I recommended a therapist, a renowned child psychologist who was famous for his work with violent young men. On my last day in the house, they took him into the city for treatment. His parents returned shortly before midnight, retiring wearily to their bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen to go over my findings. There was nothing to be said, and I knew it. Everything they'd described could be written off to the hysterics of a family who couldn't admit their son was in desperate need of medical attention. Everything, that is, except for the drains in the floor. Upon touring the home, I was impressed with how up-to-date it had been brought. It was clearly from the early 1900s and kept in immaculate condition. The woodwork and character of the house was carefully preserved, as it was given necessary updates, like modern plumbing and electricity. The basement was the only area that seemed stuck in time. The walls were a clammy stone that was prone to gathering moisture, leaving it unfit to store anything vulnerable to spiders or mold. The family had left it empty for this reason. While it certainly felt very spooky to spend any amount of time in the windowless room with a single hanging light and its vast cement floors, I never recorded anything of note in this area. However, there was one thing I couldn't understand. Given the approximate time the home had been built and its presence in a residential neighborhood, there was simply no accounting for the 4 large slotted drains set in the cold concrete floor. As I sat alone in the kitchen, poring over my meager findings, trying to find meaning in all these words, I heard something. It was only a little sound at first, and so I ignored it. But then it came again, louder this time. There was a steep spiral staircase that led to the second floor, winding up from the corner of the small kitchen, and it was where the noise seemed to be coming from. Assuming it was simply one of the homeowners restless after dropping their son off in an institution, I glanced up. It was coming down the stairs. I can't say walking, because that wasn't the case. It was just, floating isn't even the right word. Just coming. Coming down the stairs straight at me. It had no eyes. It had no face. And yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, right at me, into the very depths of my soul. Then it spoke. I'm not sure how it spoke. I don't think I actually heard anything. So perhaps it used some sort of telepathy? Either way, I can recall the words to this very day. You know what he did to us. I didn't think so. I couldn't. I just ran. I upended my chair when I fled, scattering papers across the kitchen that claimed this house wasn't really haunted. It was all the hallucinations of a very sick boy. I left them there. Do you know how awful that is? I left those people in that house with that thing. I didn't stop driving for 30 miles, for God's sake. When I realized how far I'd gone, I finally pulled over and called the family from a payphone. They were the furthest thing from my mind when I saw it. All I could do was respond to the deep animal instinct to escape, to run out of that supposedly safe house with my tail between my legs. They moved, I think. I was unable to continue my investigation. In writing, I cited insufficient evidence, but I knew it was cowardice. I believe the house was leveled a few years later. I ended up doing my own research. Curiosity ate away at me with vicious little rat teeth as time went by, the accusation still ringing fresh in my ears. You know what he did to us. And eventually, yes, I did. Old newspaper clippings didn't tie the stories together. Not necessarily, but I was able to piece some meaning out of the yellowed excerpts. At some point around the turn of the century, the house had been the residence of a well-respected mortician. Unable to find a building in town to suit his needs, he said, he built his own home office space. It was a grand feat of architecture and a shining example of a true entrepreneur, a man pursuing the American dream of running his own business. Upstairs, the bedroom. Mid-level, the funeral home. In the basement, a mortuary. I knew what the drains were for. Separately, decades later, another well-respected member of the local community was arrested under the suspicion of abuse of his professional position with moral cause. The newspaper didn't elaborate, probably due to the sensitive nature of the crimes, but his punishment was minor. After a brief stay in the local jail, the perpetrator stripped his home of all its value and left town before trial, never to be seen again. It didn't take much to guess the connection. I suppose I don't know for sure, but the words of that thing still echo through my head to this day. You know what he did to us. There was a reason that a mortician felt such a strong desire to build a house that contained his business, to suit his needs. The things that were done to those bodies in the basement were unspeakable. But yes, I know. I know what he did to them. And it's because of this, coming face to face with the true nature of man in its darkest places, that the encounter with that faceless thing is the scariest moment of my career. Because now I know. I still remember his expression, the way all the color dropped out of him as he went on, the white hair of his beard barely distinguishable from his pale skin, the slump of his shoulders, the way his voice shook. I apologized. He waved me off. He left. I felt terrible. I still feel terrible for making him relive that moment. But as I grew up, as campus activities were replaced with bills and my own career, the ghost hunter fell from the forefront of my mind little by little. Until last week, when I moved in with my fiancée, when I took the boxes into the basement despite his warnings of spiders and mold, because there's a large slotted drain in the center of the room, and I'm so worried, so scared about what I might know.